Hi guys, it's James here at Full Fat 4x4. Today I'm going to very quickly show you how I changed the track control arms on the front of the L322 Range Rover. I believe that they're all the same throughout all the model years, so this video should apply to any L322 when you need to change the track control arms.
Right guys, just before we get started, a quick note on tools. So some of the things here are essential. I would suggest that if you haven't got any of these tools, maybe might be worth outsourcing the job. But we'll start off with, we've got a torque wrench. We've got both 22 and 21 impact sockets. We've got a 8mm, and also you'll need a 10mm socket depending on the screw head sizes for the wheel arch cover. So this particular car had a mix of 8 and 10mm, don't know why. I then have two 21mm spanners. You don't need them both to be ratchet, but it does help if you've got at least one ratchet spanner. And that is for the bolt which holds the track control arm to the front subframe. I then have two axle stands to support the vehicle, and a third in order to give the track control arm the old tappity tap job. Ooh, that reminds me, you'll also need a decent sized hammer, Exhibit A, and just because it makes my life easier, also a pry bar, that is just to get the bolt out of the subframe carrier. You can just sometimes need a bit of persuading. A good torch is very helpful. Some kind of impact gun is also very helpful to get the wheel nuts off if they're super seized. You may also need a 23mm socket if your wheel nuts are seized, but this one was fine. It was fine with the 22s. Right, and then last but not least, you will then need some kind of method to gain access to the vehicle in order to torque up the front track control bolts, the bit that attach to the subframe. For me, I'll use 4 of these handy dandy Sealy car ramps, so I can just drive the car onto those, and it gives me access underneath to torque the bolt up properly. So yeah, I'd suggest if you haven't got any of these tools, either get out and get them bought, or perhaps think about outsourcing the job. So the first step is to raise and support the vehicle. So I've got these handy dandy axle stands, and I've got them located just underneath the mounting points for the track control arms. And then I have also got the jack retained in place just as a backup safety device. Now, I recommend raising both sides of the front. So I've got 2 axle stands. And the reason for that is that in order to change the track control arms, or rather when you put them back on, you generally need to turn the steering wheel to get the knuckle into the right position in order to be able to manhandle the arm back onto the ball joint. Before you get started in earnest, I would recommend that you remove the 3 screws which just hold this lower part of the wheel arch liner in place. And the reason for that is that once you can remove that out the way a bit, it just gives you a bit more flexibility in order to get that bolt out instead of it getting caught on the wheel arch liner. Next up, you're going to need a breaker bar with a 21mm socket, and then also a 21mm spanner, and that is to break the bolt and the nut. Once you've broken the nut, you can use a ratchet socket or a ratchet spanner in order to undo the nut and bolt combination. Next up, we're going to use an impact socket driver with a 21mm socket. We're going in to the ball joint nut underneath, and we're going to rattle this one off. With the bolt now removed, I can turn the steering wheel to the left hand side, and that will just give us some space here, and it will just cause this arm to drop off. The next step is all about brute force and ignorance. What I've done is I've just rested one end of the track control arm on another axle stand, and a few choice taps here. These were only knocking very slightly on braking, but you can see from that perishing that these were not long for this world. The left side is a little trickier to get the bolt which holds the track control arm to the subframe out, and that is because of the exhaust port for the auxiliary heater unit. So it's a bit more fiddly. On this side, you definitely need to remove the 3
screws which hold the wheel arch liner underneath onto the chassis. I will also admit that the other side I had to stage the removal of the track control arm with the hammer because the camera wasn't filming, but this is unstaged. And it really is as easy as that. Well, assuming that your ball joint isn't completely rusty and completely seized. Installation is then the reverse process of the removal. However, I always start with attaching the track control arm to the front subframe via that bolt. It then is a bit easier to sort of manhandle the bottom of that into the ball joint, wherever that is. Yeah, there. It's easier to do it that way round rather than attach the arm to the ball joint and then up to there. Don't know why, it just seems to work easier that way. The torque for the arm to ball joint, i.e. this one here, this nut there, that is 80 Newton meters. And the torque value for this bolt here is 165 Newton meters plus 90 degrees. Now it's really important that this bolt is torqued with the vehicle in the normal ride height, i.e. you don't want to be torquing it there because this suspension is in full droop now, which is kind of the equivalent to extended off-road mode. And so if you torque that now, then the bush will be in the wrong orientation compared to the normal driving mode, and it will wear much faster. So that's a really important step, and I'll show you that a bit later in detail in the video. But the torques are very important because if they're not torqued correctly, specifically these bolts, then the arms will knock against the subframe, and you'll be able to hear that, especially when you are cornering. I have had a reputable independent specialist return a car to me where these bolts were not torqued correctly and there was a significant knock on turning. So it's a really important step of the job. Okay, so this ball joint nut is now torqued to 80 Newton meters, and this bolt is finger tight plus a little bit, and we're going to torque that up properly in a minute. Okay, and it's the same story on the other side. Note that I have changed the steering lock from full right lock to full left lock. Just makes it considerably easier to get that arm located up onto the ball joint. And again, same story, that bolt finger tight, and we're torquing this one up to 80 Newton meters. Okay, the wheels are now on both sides. I'm going to lower the vehicle, removing it from the axle stands. Bearing in mind that it will be very difficult for you to torque these wheel nuts to 145 Newton meters whilst the vehicle is in the air because there's no lock on that front axle. So what I've done is just nip these bolts up. I'll then lower the vehicle onto the ground so that there's a reaction force for me to be able to torque these nuts up properly. The vehicle is now supported on 4 ramps. Note, I've put a little chock at the back wheel. Don't ask me how I know. Double check the parking brake and the vehicle is in park. And then we're going to go underneath with the necessary tools for the torquing. Oh, I need to get a socket on that. Right, it's pretty awkward under here, but we've got the torque wrench in place to give it the old righty-tighty. You may also need a 21mm spanner just to provide some resistance to the nut, which is in there. But probably not going to be able to show you this very well. What I tend to do is support one leg, ooh, safety slippers, on the wheel to give it the old torquing. The other side is considerably more awkward. But now I've got my size 10 torquing boots on. We'll give it the old righty-tighty. This one is definitely a lot more awkward as she's a pusher. Yep. No more safety loafers here. There we go, there's the first click. Right, so the spec is she's 165 Newton meters plus another 90 degrees. Right, here we go. Right, happy days. I cannot stress enough how important that step in the job is. If you don't get that right, then you're going to have knocking arms. Okay guys, that job is now complete. As you can see, there's nothing particularly difficult in that lot, but it is a bit fiddly. What I would say is if you haven't got the tools and you haven't got a nice dry space that's well lit to work in, well, this maybe isn't the job for you. unless you want to do it on a nice summer's day on your driveway. If you don't have the tools and if you don't have the space, then it's probably worth outsourcing. You do have to have a certain degree of competence when it comes to any mechanical job on your car. And if you don't feel confident doing it, then it's definitely worth outsourcing to the professionals. Okay, hope that's been helpful for you guys. Cheers.